Welcome to this talk. It's part of the Transgender Studies Speakers Series, and we're really glad that you could be here. My name is Aaron DeBoer, and I am the founder of the Chair in Transgender Studies, the Transgender Archives, and the Moving Trans History Forward conferences. We acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Saanich peoples whose historical relationships to the land continue to this day. We are the world's first and only chair in transgender studies. That's a research chair, not the chair of a department. Unfortunately, there are no departments of transgender studies anywhere in the world. One day we hope, but not yet. So it's a research chair, and we work to provide inspiration and hope to trans plus people and our allies everywhere. We contribute to the development and communication of accurate, research-based, real-world knowledge about trans plus people, and we hope it will be used to build a better world with better policies, laws, and drive social change. We also help to build strong and resilient trans plus social and cultural communities and individual well-being by facilitating arts and cultural and social activities. And in all that we do, we are committed to applying an intersectional lens that to advance reconciliation, racial justice, and equity and inclusion for all. In addition to events like today's, we also provide leadership and many other services, including the world's largest transgender archives here at UVic in the McPherson Library, the interdisciplinary, international, and intergenerational biennial Moving Trans History Forward conferences, a variety of scholarships, is what brings us today for UVic students, and fellowships for visitors, and also arts and cultural events. Okay, so that's all the introductory remarks. Now I want to have a little bio of Wyatt and then turn it over to Wyatt for you to hear about their work. So Wyatt Maddox is a third-year PhD student in geography. He holds a Bachelor of Science from UVic in geography and a Master's of Cultural and Marine Natural Resource Management from the University of Akureyri in Iceland. He's a winner of a Chair in Transgender Studies PhD scholarship for a trans plus student studying any topic at UVic. His PhD research examines the geomorphological relationship between coastal ecosystems in response to climate change impacts. Outside of his studies, he volunteers as the chair of the Graduate Student Society, moderates a self-founded online LGBTQ plus peer support group, and delivers meals for the nonprofit Red Cedar Café. Busy guy. Between his studies and his community work, Wyatt also finds time for backcountry hiking, crafting, and good books. So the title of Wyatt's talk is Climate Change on BC Shorelines, Exploring Coastal Vegetation's Ability to Protect Shoreline. So please join me in welcoming Wyatt Maddox.
All right, thank you everyone for being here today. I really appreciate all the support that I've gotten for this. Yeah, I'm just going to go through a little brief introduction here. Starting with an acknowledgement that I am completing all of my work, all of my studying, all of my living, and all of my fun on the unceded territories of Lekwungen people. That this is unceded land that has been stewarded for generations by the Saanich, the Lekwungen, the Songhees, the Esquimalt people, and in particular, I do my research on the reserve land of the Sayo Nation, who has been incredibly supportive and has allowed me to access land that has been left absolutely pristine because of their hard work and stewardship. I would also like to extend a thank you to Aaron and to the entire Department of Transgender Studies here that this scholarship has meant so much to me and really changed my learning this year. It's made a lot of things possible for me in a year that was particularly difficult. My supervisor is away on maternity leave this year. I have never before had my own vehicle, and I was running out of options in actually transporting this extremely expensive and extremely heavy equipment out to kind of remote sites. So this scholarship has really enabled me to actually physically complete my work and allowed me to collect some incredible data that I'm hoping will make a really meaningful change in literature and in our climate change approaches. So starting off, Erin already gave me a great little bio there, but I did graduate in 2017 from here in geography. I immediately ran off to Iceland and went to a small satellite institution called the University Center of the West Fjords. I earned my coastal marine natural resource management master's, and I completed a thesis that was focused in coastal geomorphology, which is what I focus on now. I did a brief stint with the natural resource specialist position in BC provincial government, where I worked in mining, and very quickly decided that that was not the place for me. And I applied to come back here, and I was lucky enough to be accepted into the PhD program here, where I'm now working on coastal geomorphology once again. So a little blurb about my master's here, because this is what really set me on my path of my passion, what I'm really interested in, and what I kind of want to dedicate my life to. So this is Isafjordur. It's a tiny town. The region itself is 2,500 people. That's their entire province. They have cruise ships come in here that triple the actual population of the region. The town is primarily out on this spit in the middle of the fjord. And it is an interdisciplinary program, which means that it had a few different streams that I could take, and I decided to take a science-based stream with a small caveat that I was working on policy as well. And it does offer two different programs now. I did the coastal marine management, and again, my thesis was coastal geomorphology. And as fantastic as this program was, it was actually Iceland itself that made me really interested in this work because of things like this. You can see just the phenomenal sites that are available there all around the coast. We have incredible mountains that rise directly out of the water. There's very little vegetation there, so the coastal geomorphology, the coastal sediments and such are so visible. You can see all the processes that are acting on them. It's an incredibly pristine space where you can see how the elements and nature are all working without our interference as people. I have a bad habit of taking a lot of photographs and I never get to really share them with people. So I'm taking this opportunity. So now I'm here doing PhD and I work in the geomorphology of coastal systems lab. We call ourselves the geckos. We're downstairs, we're actually directly below here. But my PI, primary investigator, is Dr. Eva Quall. She's currently away on mat leave, but she's a phenomenal geomorphologist, and I'm really lucky to be working with her. But we get to do all sorts of cool things in this lab. So we do remote sensing, which means that we're using instruments to look at things that we couldn't actually see visibly. We do sediment collection. We work in different coastal ecologies. These are tiny plants that have been replicated and made with plastics. And we put them in a flume here. So the flume is basically a big giant fish tank where we can run all sorts of currents through it and see how these little plants will react. We work in climate data. We work collaboratively. This is when we were doing some work up in Prince Rupert with the Metlakatla. They have a Sea Shepherd organization and they help us a lot with doing research in that area. And then we also get to do just lots of really fun field trips where we're out in the coastline and actually collecting that data in person, which is incredibly fun. And I will actually be doing this later today after this talk. So today I'm going to go through a few different things. I'm going to talk about coastal geomorphology because that's a whole bunch of really long words that don't mean a lot to many people. Then I'm going to talk about salt marshes, eelgrass. I'm going to go a little bit into the climate change impacts that these see. And then this coupled salt marsh and eelgrass dynamic, which is really the focus of my research. And finally, I'm going to talk about all of those little nitpicky research objectives that I have. So climate change has a whole bunch of different impacts on coastal regions, and this is by far not a comprehensive list. But today, we're going to focus specifically on sea level rise, erosion, and flooding. Not that the others have little impact, but that these are the ones that are of primary concern for my research. So this is actually BC coast here. This I took on the Wanapika Trail We got some incredible shale, but we're going to talk about what geomorphology actually is here. I'm going to break it down into the Greek base. Geo means earth, morph is the forms and the change, and logos is the study. So you put them all together and we're looking at the study of Earth's forms and changes. And this is a very intersectional science. So a lot of sciences find themselves in great silos. Here, we get to spread out our wings and explore a whole bunch of different aspects. So geology is, of course, very important, but we also have a lot of physics that goes into this with very scary equations. We have biology, and we also have chemistry, which I try to stay as far away from as possible. Now, the formation and processes of coastal landforms is really the bread and butter of geomorphology. This is dictated by a number of different things, but these are the primary aspects of it. Hydrodynamics is what engineers like to call fluid mechanics. So this, again, is a lot of physics. But it really does determine how these coastal landforms are made. None of these changes could really occur without the facilitation of water and wind and other aspects like that to move particles. It's also based on the geological composition. So in areas where we have more resistant rocks versus less resistant rocks, we might see very different formations occurring rather than areas that are very similar. There's also seasonality, so climate and weather have a huge impact. And finally, ecology, with these two big words, bioturbation and biostabilization. These are big words, but they're actually very simple and they're the opposite of one another. Bioturbation is when ecology of any sort causes the sediment to move or change. And biostabilization is just the opposite. It keeps the sediments, the rocks, everything where it is. But they're both just catalyzed by the presence of some sort of biological organism. So we're going to start in on erosion first. So erosion, as we commonly think of it, is actually more closely related to the term weathering. So erosion is the actual removal of the sediments. Weathering is the act that's happening upon them. So the processes here can be physical, chemical, and biological. So up on the top left here, we have physical weathering. Physical weathering is what you think of generally when you think of erosion. You've got water, wind, even other pieces of rock that are causing some physical harm to the rock that changes that shape. Chemical, on the other hand, this is limestone caves that were pictured in Thailand. And in that case, you have water that's actively dissolving sediments. And then as it drips down, those actually become glued back again to the rock. So that changes the look of it over time. And biological, despite the fact that this rock has been carved by people, it's actually now being more affected by biology in the case that we're seeing the roots that will actually probably eventually cover and crack apart this rock. And this happens in natural spaces as well. So then once it's eroded, we see a transport system. This is the general transport system for the coast. So you see, we have most of our sediments that come either from somewhere else on the coast or down through rivers, streams, sometimes overland flow. So if there's a flood or if there's a lot of rainwater, once they reach the coast, they're transported, and that's based on the climate of the waves. So which direction the waves are facing, which again is dictated by the wind. So they'll deposit in certain areas, they might resuspend and come back up. They might find a home for 100,000 years, and then they might find a new home. They eventually find what we call a sink. So this one has a submarine canyon here, but you'll also see that along the edge of this jetty or the sand spit, those are what we call sinks. So every bit of sediment moves from a source to a sink. Now, this one's going to get a little bit scary, so just ignore the math if you don't want to look at it. But shear stress is a really important part of this because shear stress is friction. It's the friction with the bottom, whether that's the bottom of a water body or dry land, that causes the sediment to resuspend. So this is mainly based in currents, waves, and wind. So even though a particle may have deposited once, it can get blown back up into whatever the current flow is going through it. In the top left here, you'll notice there's a whole bunch of different arrows, and it really depends on the sediment size, what kind of movement it's going to take. And that doesn't mean that it's going to automatically come right back up into the main part of the flow and go very far. It could be moving millimeters at a time. Then the last part of this really is deposition. Deposition is a ratio of particle weight and flow velocity. So that means that if you've got something heavier and you don't have a very fast flow, that heavy thing is going to sink and stay on the bottom. But if that flow were to speed up enough, that heavy thing could move again. This is the primary graph that we use to explain it. We've got particle size on the bottom here, ranging from clay, which is very, very fine, all the way to boulders and cobbles on this side, which are very large. And here, this is a flow velocity based on centimeters per second. But as you can see, with things like clay, they almost never deposit. So that sediment is suspended in the water column almost indefinitely. But you move all the way to the other far end and you've got boulders. And depending on the size of that boulder, it may never move. But there are some on the smaller side that could be transported by an extremely strong flow. So that could be something like the big floods that we saw a couple of years ago. And then at the very top, you have erosion. So this is where your flow is so strong that it's actually causing active erosion on the particles involved. Now, the thing here, and I've mentioned a couple of times, is that deposition is not a final place. Deposition has a continuing process that includes accretion, which I just like to think of as gluing. Accretion just means it's deposited, it's glued down into whatever the bottom is there, but it can also be resuspended again. And then we also have this last term, subsidence. So subsidence is when under its own weight or because of external pressures, you see a deposit move. So the most obvious example of this is a landslide. So that is another way that you could have particles move after they've been deposited. So now I'm going to talk very specifically about salt marshes. And they're this really incredible space that exists only between the ocean and the land in a very minute margin. I'm going to start off by defining the different parts of the coast just to be clear so that none of my jargon gets out of hand here. So upland is what we think of as terrestrial. So that's where we see all of the plants and trees that we're used to seeing in our backyards everywhere. But the supratidal is an area that is in between that upland area and where the tide generally comes up to. Now that area can see a lot of woody debris. We tend to see that a lot here on BC coast, but that area is very, very infrequently seeing waves or tides actually coming all the way up onto it. So primarily in storms, as well as super high tides, king tides in the summers. And then moving down, we get to the intertidal. So this is that zone between the high tide and the low tide mark. And then finally, the subtidal, which is almost never dry. So this area, again, only in those king tides when we see a real divergence in that length of tide. And then the foundation of salt marsh, basically how a salt marsh comes to be. It's based on both deposition and subsidence. And those sources, again, for the sediments can come from estuaries, adjacent bays, offshore, and backshore sources. So however it's deposited there, whether it's coming down the side of a cliff or a bluff, or if it's being washed up from maybe a sandbar that's offshore, you eventually end up with a platform that's dry enough of the time to be colonized by plants. And we call these plants halophytic because they like salt. It's a very specific subset of plants. Again, you don't have very many that can survive in this environment, and they're very specialized. But they're very important because they also stabilize the sediment. So they ensure that these platforms can remain as they are, even with harsh waves and currents. So the salt marsh is what I call a dynamic depositional form. So that means it changes constantly. I'm going to introduce these two new terms, vertical and lateral. So vertical is just up and down, but lateral is horizontal. So that means out towards the sea and back towards the land. And that's how it moves in these processes. It exists only in the inter to supratidal area. So remember that's up near the top margin of that tidal range. And it has a sand, silt, mud platform, so it's really mixed in substrates. It can be more of one depending on what the source is and how close it is, especially time of year can change that. But it's preceded by these tidal flats or mud flats that extend oceanward. And then it's entirely dependent on that tidal range. So here we have the tides in here with the highest spring tides going up and covering only a little bit of those highest plants. And then you've got mean tides that are inundating very infrequently. So then the salt marsh itself is made up of a whole bunch of structures, and these structures all trade sediment pieces. So the sediment is able to move from one of these structures to another, but other parts are better at capturing that sediment and maintaining it. So the platform, this is an example in Boundary Bay and Delta on mainland. So everything that is covered by vegetation on this is the platform. So it's very easy to see where it ends, and that end is what we call a scarp. Now, scarps can range from very sharp, like this one. You can see this one's actually been undercut at what we call the toe or the bottom. So that means it's eroding out at the bottom. But the one on the left here, we can see actually doesn't have that sharp edge on it. And that can really tell us a lot about whether or not it's actively eroding at the time. We have ecological organization. So again, we start up here, we've got terrestrial animals and plants. And as we move down the marsh, it really changes what type of flora and fauna that we are seeing. And within that area, as we get closer, we see what are called tidal channels. So tidal channels are anywhere that there's sediments that are a little less cohesive. So that means that the water coming in has been able to erode out what we call a nick point, and been able to force its way up through the marsh. And these are really important because it means that the supertidal areas of the marsh actually do get that delivery of salt water that they need in order to maintain halophytic plants. And lastly, we have tidal flats. Here are three of my volunteers stuck in the mud. Tidal flats are very smelly, but they can range from only a few meters wide to, in this case, well over 4 kilometers from the edge of the salt marsh out to the lowest low tide range. So they're made up of very unconsolidated sediments, which makes them very sticky, makes it very easy to sink in them. Sometimes we actually wear snowshoes to go out on these. The maintenance of the marsh comes down to natural erosion and accretion cycles. So that's sediment taken away and sediment movement. And when we look at that, it's based heavily on the temporal variability. So we've got tidal, which changes. Here we've got two different kind of tidal regimes that we switch between. We're called a semi-diurnal. That means that every 2 weeks, we kind of flip-flop back and forth. We have one range where we get a very high tide and a very low tide, and we only have one of each per day. And then we have the other end of the range where we have kind of two more moderate ones of each. So we end up with 2 low tides and 2 high tides per day. And so that can change how much sediment is being delivered. If one tide is able to go over the top of the salt marsh and the other is not, then we can only have deposition from the first tide. The seasonal aspect is also important. I can only primarily do my research in the summer months because, especially the fall and spring, we tend to not have very high tides. Even right now, most of those really high and low tides are occurring around midnight. So during the summer, they happen just before noon, and then in the winter, right at midnight. And then the lateral versus vertical accretion is really interesting in salt marshes because they are almost always opposite. So the vertical accretion means that it's rising up, and that's caused by the deposition as water comes over top. It makes contact with all of those grasses, and it slows down that flow. Remember, slower flow means that we have more deposition. So as it rises, a lot of that content that's coming out of the water is actually eroded directly off the lateral side of the marsh. So you end up with this movement that goes like this. And then the opposite is true as well with the lateral morphology, which can have erosion from wave impacts, but it can also be the subsidence of the top platform. So you end up with this balancing scale where if it's growing vertically, it's retreating laterally. And if it's growing laterally, it's actually subsiding vertically. Here's a much more complicated way of putting it. but I'm going to explain it here. So based on the plant structures, we're seeing a lot of deposition. And this is, again, the tidal range. So we actually start here. This is graph one here. You can see that there's a few little tiny plants that have just been popping up there. And that's the original scarp. And let's see, yes, my mouse does work there. So you can see there's the original scarp there. As we move through time, those plants are able to cause deposition and raise the area that they're in. And eventually, by the time you get up to the top one, it's actually become even with the original platform. And you can see we have new little baby plants there that are starting to grow up. And so that's how it will eventually move out laterally and grow. It's through the colonization of plant material. Now, the bad part, marsh drowning. This is what we're really trying to avoid because it's the destruction of an ecosystem entirely. This can mean that there has to be shoreward migration of the salt marsh. This can cost us agricultural land, suburban, urban, recreational land, as well as important ecosystems. It also causes this thing called coastal squeeze. So coastal squeeze is when there's any kind of building that we've put close to the coast, but it can also be a natural structure close to the coast that causes the area for that retreat to be minimized. So a lot of our coasts here, we've built our houses right up to the beach, which means that if that coast needs to move back, there's nowhere for it to go. The loss of the ecosystem services is a really important part as well. So because they slow down the waves and the erosion, these salt marshes are providing us protection from inundation, wave impacts, and salinization of our soils. Now, these don't just impact our activities, but they actually impact all of the natural activities that are happening in these areas as well. So when we have a marsh that isn't able to keep up with the rising sea level, then we end up in a space where we have a drowned marsh and it can actually die entirely. So moving on to eelgrass meadows, these are incredible keystone species. They're structures that provide barriers again, but they are also incredibly important nursery habitats. Eelgrass can come in a bunch of different forms. There's actually an even larger umbrella term of seagrasses that I've used here, but we have some that are little tiny ones like that, and they grow all the way up to big ones like this, depending on the species. They're all halophytic, which means they love salt, obviously, but they're kind of like whales. They started out in the sea, they came onto land, and they decided they didn't like that much. So they've gone back to the ocean, and that's where they live. They are the only species of plant in the ocean. Now, they occupy that subtidal to mid-intertidal zone. So some of them never actually get entirely out of the water, but some of them do get a little bit depending on tidal range. But they're very vulnerable to drying and temperature changes. So it really restricts the area that they can live in. And they're also restricted by light availability. So they can't grow way out into the depths. The most recent estimate I could find was from 2020, but there is about 160,000 square kilometers of coast globally that are covered by eelgrass meadows. Now, the structure of the eelgrass itself, again, the only true plants in the ocean, it relies on these cuticles within the leaves. So that's actually these just little pockets or little balloons that help it to float in the water. Otherwise, it would just kind of flop down. But the rhizomes and the roots are at the bottom here. Those anchor into sediment. This makes it different than other things like algae and things like kelp, which are macroalgae. Those anchor onto things like rocks. They have these sticky little graspers at the bottom. These need fine sediment in order to grow and to find a space that they can occupy regularly. But the leaves are also highly malleable, so they flow really well, even though they're very buoyant. They are very seasonal, so they have abscission is the technical term for their leaves fall off in the fall. So they have 75% of leaf loss in the fall, which means that as much as they can protect by diminishing flow during the summer, you know, when we don't have very many storms and waves, when it comes to fall, they've actually lost a lot of that foliage. And so then they are kind of diminished. But they do flower and pollinate in the spring, and then they have fruiting in the autumn. And then they also have this ability to propagate through the rhizomes. So that's the part underneath here, not the roots, but just at the edge of the surface here. And so you can have lots of little plants. Once in a while, you'll find them on the beach where you have a whole string of them attached. But here we have two different types. So we have Zostera marina and Zostera japonica. Now, Zostera marina is our native species, and this is commonly called giant eelgrass. It's quite large. It grows up to 3 meters long and 1 to 2 centimeters wide, whereas our Zostera japonica is invasive, and it can only, it says up to 34 meters, or sorry, that should be 30, oh, it is 34 centimeters. Says that it grows up to 34 centimeters. I've never seen it longer than 15 centimeters. It's quite small. And then it's only 1.5 millimeters wide, so very tiny comparatively. The only issue when trying to identify these is that the immature Zostera marina can look very similar to our japonica. They do occupy separate niches within the same region. So the Zostera japonica tends to sit on the crest of little ripples of sand, whereas the Zostera marina is much more fragile when it comes to drying and temperature, and so it occupies those troughs that hold water when the tide goes out. They do have the very diverging characteristics, and they may not compete, which means that Zostera japonica might not actually fall into the definition category of invasive. But they do have similar sediment stabilization abilities, which is wonderful because Zostera japonica tends to colonize areas where Zostera marina has been removed. So if it's been dredged, or if it's been the climate of the tide has changed in that area, or anything of that sort, we do see colonization of the other type, which means that we are still seeing that stabilization effect. Now, they both run through these amazing positive feedback cycles. So as they grow, they're better able to attenuate the flow of the water, which means that there's increased deposition of particles. That means the water is clearer, and it also means that there's more nutrients delivered to the plants themselves, which means that they get more sunlight and more nutrients, so they can grow larger, so they can attenuate more flow, so they can increase deposition. And it's this great cycle where they self-perpetuate. Now, the attenuation and flow itself, we have wave and current attenuation through the friction with the leaves. So basically it means that if the flow is going, it hits the leaf and the leaf bends a little bit, but doesn't allow the flow to continue at the same rate. That causes the sediment deposition, but also retention. So it means that it's holding onto that sediment once it's deposited. And then there is a very scary mathematical equation for this one. And yeah, we do not need to go into that one. But they do have this incredible thing called a Monami effect. So this means that as the flow goes right over top of the canopy of the eelgrass meadow, it creates these vortices. So think of waves. Waves are always toppling like this. They actually have this effect where they wave in tandem with the flow, and that prevents these circular vortices from going down into the meadow and causing the resuspension of particles within it. Now, that is really impacted by the varying density of meadows. The boundary flow layer that's over top of the canopy needs to be continuous. And if you have a less dense meadow like this one on the bottom, you are more susceptible to what we call turbulent penetrating eddies, which is a very fancy word for like little spirals of water. It can also cause what we call edge scour. So that means that even if you have a very dense meadow like this, if it has a sharp edge at one point or a very undense part of it, then you can actually see a lot of erosion in specifically those areas. It also has stem level turbulence, which means that at each individual leaf and stem, you can see these little turbulent eddies that cause resuspension. So eelgrass and climate change, it has its benefits and its impediments here. Primary one is that eelgrass is a phenomenal carbon sink. So it's been said that eelgrass is sinking as much carbon as the Amazon rainforest. I don't know how true that one is. But incredibly, eelgrass actually has improved photosynthesis with higher CO2 in our oceans, which means that as our oceans get more and more acidic, we're looking at actually improved conditions for eelgrass. It protects our coastlines from wave impacts, and it also has what's called responsive colonization, which means that as the sea level rises, it's more likely to move towards the shore and respond. So rather than being entirely destroyed, like the salt marsh has the potential to, it will actually colonize in response to those changing climates. Unfortunately, it does still have some quite significant impediments. So continued dredging, that means that when people go out and they pull the sediment out of the bottom so that we can park more boats around, we tend to rip out the eelgrass because that's their prime habitat. There's obviously polluted waters contributing to murkiness, which doesn't allow them to photosynthesize effectively. There's a blight recovery that's happening right now in the Atlantic. So the Atlantic eelgrass population is the exact same species of Zostera marina as we have here. But in the 1930s, a fungus or a virus went through all of those plants, all up and down both American and European and African coasts, and basically destroyed the populations. It's been a huge restoration effort in the last few years to bring back those populations. But at this point, despite being the exact same species, those populations only grow to be about 0.5 meter to 1 meter long, while ours grow up to 3 meters. Another one is the overgrazing by geese. So we've managed to eradicate all of the geese's natural predators. So now we have geese eating all of our eelgrass. And then also the increased storm intensity can actually rip the eelgrass directly out of the sediments, which is a big concern. Now we'll move into the climate change impacts that affect both eelgrass and salt marshes. We're looking at up to 1 meter by 2100. So that's a pretty significant change in a very short amount of time. This will cause increased erosion where we have wave impacts that are delivered to higher elevations. So elevations that have not historically been in the path of wave impacts. And there's also less depth leading up to those now as the sea level rises. So you might see where you had a beach leading up to a cliff. Suddenly there's no beach in front of it. The water is hitting directly onto the cliff. Also, the nearshore currents will now impact what was the beach because they're now running directly over the beach and removing those sediments. And we're also looking at really increased inundation periods. So that means that as our sea level rises, our highest tide line is moving farther and farther up. We've got a few different scenarios here where the most mild is actually quite good for both of our species. We have somewhat increased frequency of tides overtopping marshes, which means we're likely to see more deposition on marshes. They will go vertically, and then we'll have waves that are reaching farther into the back shore, which is probably not great. And we have vertical accretion improving, decreased lateral erosion. That means that we're seeing less of waves hitting that scarp and eroding the edge of the salt marsh because we have less time when the tide is actually at the level of the scarp, more time when it's over that. And then low impacts to eelgrass in this scenario. In the moderate section, we have tides consistently overtopping, waves carrying greater force closer to shore, which could rip up both eelgrass and salt marsh species. And vertical accretion is going to really increase because you're going to have stronger waves. So that means you're going to have more flow carrying larger sediments, and they're going to be slowing down directly on top of the salt marshes. And then you're going to see some lateral erosion and probably some vertical erosion as those stronger waves start to actually resuspend sediment on top. And of course, in the severe scenario, it's all just the worst. So we have tides frequently inundating the marsh. They might drown out the marsh entirely. They cause root disturbance and mass wasting effects. So while we do have really great stabilization from all of these species, it does put us in this very delicate position of when there is actually roots removed entirely, it causes destabilization of a large area. So it can rip out a whole bunch of roots. And then we also have accretion and salinization farther up the marsh. So that can actually allow the marsh to move backward if it has room to. And then major lateral erosion because now we don't have any protection for that edge of the marsh, or it's completely underwater and it's lost its stabilization vegetation. We also have the eelgrass and salt marsh retreating landward if they can. So now we can look at how do they actually go together. So we have a question here, whether it's synergy or a struggle. When we got salt marsh and eelgrass moving together, we have impacts of waves at the source of scarp erosion. That can be limited by the presence of the eelgrass itself. So less energy in the nearshore currents causes more deposition. So if you've got a seagrass out here that's cutting down those currents and those waves before they can ever reach that salt marsh, you're going to see a lot less erosion happening. But if the eelgrass retains sediments in the summer too much, it might mean that the salt marsh is actually deprived of those sediments that it really needs to grow. And it might release those sediments in the winter when really there's so much erosion happening that it's not going to deposit on the marsh itself. So we're kind of asking here, is this relationship positive or negative? And the question is, we don't. So existing research is focused heavily on numerical modeling. This means that they're taking different equations that have been proven to be correct. And unfortunately, at this point, there's no field-based studies to substantiate their findings. So we have plenty of field-based studies for eelgrass, and we have plenty of field-based studies for salt marsh. And then they take the two models and they shove them together. And we just don't know if that is really what happens. So all of these studies so far have been situated in Chesapeake Bay, Virginia, and New Jersey, which are all areas with what we call barrier islands. So these little islands protect the coast, and they're generally made of sediments that move frequently. But we don't really have those here, so it can't really be that applicable to us. The other thing is, as I already talked about, their eelgrass is much different. So trying to apply these numerical models to our coast just doesn't really work. So going into my research, which I'm hoping will answer these questions, I'm using a bunch of different methodologies to try and answer this. Starting off on the far left here, LiDAR it's light detection and ranging. It's essentially a whole bunch of tiny little laser points that are sent out generally in the scope of millions. And it has about a 12 to 25 centimeter margin for error. And you're able to create a 3D model that you can twist and turn every direction. And you can look at the changing geomorphology. Now, I'm using a little bit of LiDAR. It's really expensive and it's hard to fly because it has to be on drone or on airplane, and they're both expensive and don't fly well during bad weather. And they also have to be flown at low tide, which is very hard to get them to do if you're not going to pay them a lot of money. So I primarily actually work in terrestrial laser scanning. So this is exactly the same thing. You've got lots of tiny little lasers being shot out, but my margin for error is 0.5 to 4 centimeters. And the reason for this is that my terrestrial laser scanner sits on a tripod. So it sits there, it spins around for 3 minutes, and it's agonizingly slow. But I end up with this, which gives me such a better resolution. And I can't look at nearly as large areas, but it means that I get that high definition that I need to see for those geomorphological changes that are happening in seasonal and other such short-term periods. Now I combine that with what I call multi-beam sonar. So everybody kind of knows what sonar is. It's like when it's up and it goes boom, 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 boom. So it's made up of little sound waves, and basically based on the echoes that you get back from those sound waves, it creates a 3D image again. This one is orthophotos. So it is kind of what it sounds like. It's photos. This one has been given a filter to make it easier to see with the red there. But it's essentially taking a few photos of the same area from different angles, and you put them together, you're actually able to create 3D image items. And then the last one is a completely different technology than all the others. It's an acoustic Doppler current profiler. And what this does is it actually measures flow, and it measures flow by bouncing, again, sound waves off of particles floating in the water. So it's calibrated by actually taking samples of the water and figuring out how much sediment is in it and what the size of that sediment is. And then I'm able to look at that flow and go, okay, so it's flowing faster before the eelgrass meadow and slower after the eelgrass meadow. So I've separated into 3 different primary objectives here. My first one is to look at that terrestrial laser scanner and determine, is this an effective methodology for looking at salt marshes? Because it's frankly never been used on salt marshes before, but I'm really hoping it is. So I'm doing what's called DEM to DEM differencing. So that means digital elevation model. And that's just a fancy term for that 3D model you can flip over in every direction. But I take the LiDAR and the ortho photos and I put them directly over top of my TLS. And that tells me, are they changing in the same areas? Is my terrestrial laser scanner picking up those same changes? And then am I seeing more minute changes in my terrestrial laser scanner? So I can do that through what's called geomorphic change analysis, and then a statistical comparison of the results. For the second part, I'm going to confirm if there's coupled morphology between eelgrass and salt marsh. So this is where I get into the meat and potatoes of it, where I'm looking at, do they have this geomorphic relationship? And again, I'm going to do that DEM to DEM differencing, but hopefully I've decided that TLS is the best method. And so it will be only my TLS, and I'll be able to look at interannual as well as seasonal. I'll do a statistical comparison, identify areas of change. And this is where that acoustic Doppler comes in, where I look at the flow. So I can create a flow map overlay and look at where's that change versus where's that flow, what makes sense. And then lastly, I'm going to use those models and I'm going to try and chop them up, take out the parts I don't like, add some parts that I do like, and I'm going to put in the parameters. So all of the different things that make up my sunny site, the wind regime, the waves, the climate, all of these different factors that I know about my site. And I'm going to compare that to this and see if they can produce a model that is giving me the same answers as my original determination of that relationship. And if so, then we've got a model that I can use to actually look at these sites and decide what's going to happen as climate change comes in. I can increase the sea level, I can increase storm intensity, things like that. So what this really leads to is nature-based solutions. So salt marshes and eelgrass are both under immense threat from both climate change as well as our direct anthropological involvement. So we have to work on preserving them, restoring them, reintroducing them, managing them, adapting them, so that we end up with these protections on our shorelines from climate change impacts that are entirely based in the nature of our shorelines as they are. And that is all I have for you. I hope that this was entertaining and that it wasn't a little bit too mathy, but I'm really happy to have been able to present this to you all, and I appreciate your audience.